So the presentation I want to give has 4 parts. First, I want to define 2 key terms that I will be using a lot and that you'll hear a lot this week: civil resistance and movement. Then I want to go through very quickly some major cases of civil resistance movements, some from US history, and a lot of them from 2000 onward. I will say my focus in general has been on movements against governments. So the cases I will give you are probably skewed more towards that direction, even though a lot of really interesting and very powerful movements are happening against private interests, non-state actors, or even just societal practices in various countries and societies. So I'm sure we can think of a lot more than I offer, but I'll just try to give you some to give you a sense of the geographic diversity. Then we'll talk about how civil resistance works in a conceptual, theoretical way. It seems to defy all conventional expectations that ordinary people who are facing oppression at the hands of opponents that are better armed, that have more material resources, that control the information environment, that are organized and seem to have all the advantages. It totally goes against most political conventional wisdom that ordinary people using no violence can actually win in such circumstances, right? I mean, in my undergraduate education, when I studied political science, it was never really questioned what power was, because it was just assumed power had to do with force, and force was presumed to, the only kind of force really at the end of the day was armed conflict or money and control of resources. And yet what we see, and I'll get into some statistics later on, is amazing effectiveness of ordinary people systematically changing their behavior and changing the balance of power in their society. So how does that happen? And we'll get to the record both of success of movements as well as what kind of long-term outcomes do they lead to? What kind of gains do they result for in terms of human rights and democracy? So definitions. And I want to start with an image. Where do you think this image was taken? This was Egypt in 2011. And when we think about civil resistance, the first thing that pops in many people's minds, and even my own mind, is a protest, right? A demonstration. People go out on the streets and say we're unhappy about something and we want something else. Or just we're unhappy about something. And this is an image that the media gives again and again and again and again for very understandable reasons. I mean, here we have the kind of image that a journalist knows would attract attention. We have conflict. We have lots of people. We don't know what's going to happen. It's dramatic. And so there are lots of reasons why we continue to get images of protest. Of course, when we start to think, well, civil resistance, this is really about the study of protests, it can also limit us in some ways. In this particular image, because we're focusing on, possibly because we're focusing on an area of real conflict with the police, you have a lot of men there. Actually, in many cases, actually, you'll have women in the front lines, but in this, you have a lot of men. And so it doesn't necessarily show the gender balance of the movement at all, because we know women were taking a very active role. We also know that there are many images taken of a violent conflict here, and masses of nonviolent people behind them, and the media images, of course, of a small violent portion of that demonstration. And sometimes even the violent demonstrators are actually agents of the movement's opponent. And so there's lots of ways that focusing on demonstrations as an image can be misleading. But certainly they can be incredibly powerful, as we know. But civil resistance goes far beyond that. So here's another image. When do you think this image was taken, or what do you think it is an image of? Rosa Parks, 1955, in the city of Montgomery, Alabama. Here we have an example of civil resistance. There's no clear conflict we can see. We must understand the context to even get what's going on. And yet this action, in that context, was incredibly powerful. And I would argue probably more powerful than if they'd done mass demonstrations in that context. Now, if we're going to have a definition of the term civil resistance, we have to find a definition that can cover the kind of mass demonstration and also cover something like a bus boycott. So how do we get there? And there was one of the first theorists, major theorists in this field is a man named Dr. Gene Sharp, who actually lives in Boston. And he was faced with this challenge when he was looking at movements throughout history and trying to come up with a common definition of what exactly he was trying to focus on. And Gene used the term nonviolent action to describe the phenomenon that he was interested in. I use the term civil resistance. We basically mean the same thing. And so what I'm giving you here is a paraphrasing. I've sort of narrowed down Gene's definition a little bit as follows. Civil resistance is a way for people, often ordinary people who have no special status or privilege, to wield power without using violence. And in this case, violence is a narrow definition. It is the threat or use of physical force to hurt or kill other people. So it's a narrow definition of violence. We can get into structural violence, psychological violence, and other forms of violence later, but for the purposes of keeping this as a clear definition, we narrowly define violence here. And it consists of three kinds of actions. And the first is acts of commission. This is where people do things that they're not supposed to do, that they're not expected to do, or that are illegal for them to do. So protesting, you could argue, in many countries is an act of commission. Though it's interesting, I've seen some people argue that actually in the United States, protest has become so routine that it's almost not a form of nonviolent action anymore because it's really so ordinary that it's not outside of the ordinary. It's not something that people don't expect anymore. But then you can get into issues of, well, what kind of protest is it? How are they protesting? And so forth. So there are different ways people can do an action that could make it very ordinary or actually turn it into an act of civil resistance, an act of commission. In some cases, if I wore certain colors, showed certain symbols, of course, that could be an act of civil resistance. But if I did it in my own country, it might not be. So those are acts of commission. The second kind, of course, is acts of omission. Refusing to do things that you are expected to do, supposed to do, or required by law to do. And there are a great many creative ways people can choose to withhold their consent, right? We can choose to not pay taxes, not pay utility bills, not buy certain products, not go to work slowly, refuse to go. There are endless, actually, ways you can choose not to obey. Pull your money out of various financial institutions and so forth. Refuse to recognize certain holidays. Refuse to obey certain social norms or certain cultural norms. And then the third would be a combination of both. And this is where, for example, have people heard of a boycott? So this is where I refuse to buy one product and really try to buy another product instead. It's a combination of omission and commission. Another example would be if I started a school in my living room for my children. I have 2 children. And I took them out of U.S. public schools, which I can do, actually, legally, and started an alternative school for revolution in my living room. And then I started pulling other kids from the neighborhood into that school, too. That would be an act of commission and omission. I'm creating an alternative institution, and I'm pulling people by omission out of their regular institutional participation. And when we look at the definition this way, I've always sort of fallen back on this definition because it's very clear social science. It separates out the acts and the phenomenon of civil resistance with some of the ethical or religious or moral belief system that has sometimes been associated with it. I have absolutely nothing against those belief systems, and people can argue, I think sometimes quite convincingly, that they can be very helpful. But for the purpose of studying it and trying to analyze it, it's helpful to look at it as a mode of action, a mode of struggle, and focusing on the acts. Another point I would make is that when we look at it from this definition, we can see that I would argue it's really universal. It's not something necessarily that was created by Gandhi. It's not something necessarily that was created from any particular culture or tradition. I have 2 children, as I said. They understand this very well. No one had to teach them, right? Do people, if you work with kids, you see. They understand acts of omission and commission, right? So if I want my children to do something, they might stall, sort of work slowly, make excuses, blah, blah, blah. And then if they really want a popsicle, if they keep sort of non-violently disobeying, making it difficult, and there's two of them, so it's really hard. You know, they're like a little movement. It's not just one. I'm not dealing with a dissident. I'm dealing with dissidents. And they might get into a negotiation with their dad about, you know, okay, fine, just get in the car. Here's a popsicle, whatever, right? And so I think all of you in your lives have been in situations, maybe it was in the workplace, maybe it was in the classroom, maybe it was hanging out with people who sort of drove you crazy because they were so difficult, where you start to realize, I'm going to sort of slowly kind of change the way I act around these people. I'm going to sort of not be so motivated to do what I'm supposed to do, or I'm going to openly speak out. And that, in my understanding, is sort of a basic impulse that all of us have. And I would argue that part of what movements do is take that basic psychological impulse and help people systematically channel it through unifying, organizing actions to target very clear points of political, economic, or social pressure to try to create change. Now, this is not, of course, by saying this, this is not, of course, to underplay the importance of Gandhi or other amazing theorists and thinkers about this who have brought the idea of using this as a form of struggle very far and pushed it very far. The contributions have been huge. But at the core, I think this is just part of our human identity and human history. And so some characteristics I've sort of covered on it. By definition here, we're saying civil resistance is extra-institutional. It's outside institutions. It's based on not doing what you're supposed to do or doing what you're not supposed to do. Now, of course, in actual fact, movements frequently use institutional means and civil resistance together in movements quite a bit. They vote, they may use the legal system, they may use international mechanisms, and they may engage in civil resistance. And what we see is that when systems of accountability and the formal structures are so broken down that the system can no longer correct itself, that extra institutional pressure can sometimes shift things and get institutions working again, or sometimes replace those institutions. It's highly adaptable and creative. In 1973, Gene Sharp, who I mentioned earlier, cataloged 198 different civil resistance tactics, or he called them methods. And that was an amazing list. He gave an example of each, 198, and that was in 1973. And if you think about it, every movement creates new tactics, new ways. There are so many rules, official and unofficial rules we have to obey that we can be very creative in finding ways to shift them. And each way that we can find is potentially a new tactic. In fact, the internet has also opened up a whole new domain that didn't exist years ago for engaging in acts of civil resistance. And the underlying premise, if we accept this definition, is that the power of elites and institutions is based on the consent and cooperation of those who serve them. We're going to get into that a little bit more later when we get to how movements work. But fundamentally, what's the point of a definition about doing things you're not supposed to do or not doing things you're supposed to do if there isn't some power there? We're talking about movements. Sharp was interested in how movements exercise power, and if his definition is all about obedience and behavior, part of what we infer from that is that the obedience and consent of thousands or millions of people in a society often indirectly helps maintain the status quo and enable power holders to continue, and when they're oppressive, enables them to continue to be oppressive. Okay, so that's a definition of civil resistance, which you certainly, I welcome any questions or problematizing it. But civil resistance by itself is not sufficient. There are plenty of examples of very brave individuals or dissidents who take a strong stand, and they may make the headlines, they may get in the newspaper, but of course, by themselves, it doesn't necessarily change anything. And so the power in civil resistance really comes about through movements, in my understanding. And it's when thousands or millions of people start to participate in these acts, that we really get power, and they do it in a sustained way. So what is a movement? This is a term that I have found has been very overused. Corporations now use it, right? They do. Join our movement for a new blah, 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 right? So it's like, basically, movements just, it means it's popular, right? Or politicians use it, right? Every campaign, join our movement. We're recruiting people to our movement. I hear that word so many times in the US politics. In my inbox, where I like subscribe to all these political lists, every NGO is like, we're starting a movement, right? Okay, let's take that word back. What does it mean? It's hard to define perfectly. And so what I've done is I've taken three definitions from scholars, and actually Bill Moyer, the first one, is a scholar practitioner, and I've added a little bit of my own in there, and I've tried to come up with something that should maybe serve as a guideline. And I'll actually highlight the words that I want to emphasize there. Ongoing. Movements persist over time. It's not just a quick upsurge necessarily. It's something that continues over time. Ongoing collective, popular, efforts aimed at bringing about consequential change in a social, economic, or political order. Movements are civilian-based. They draw their power from lots of people, involve widespread popular participation, and they have four functions. They alert. They put issues on the agenda that people aren't talking about. They force a conversation that needs to happen. They force people to look at truths they don't want to look at. They call power holders out on lies and deception. And they say, we must look at this as a society. They educate. One way that people who consider themselves not political, oh, I don't vote, the politicians are all corrupt, I don't participate, I'm just taking care of myself, and so forth. One of the ways that those people start to become active is when there is a campaign, which is sort of a, I won't get into the campaign definition, basically a movement, a local manifestation of a movement in their neighborhood. And they may say, well, you know, I really don't consider myself political. I try to stay out of all of that. It's too corrupting. But I'm very upset that we have public health crises and my children are drinking water that's not pure and getting sick. Entirely personal concern, not necessarily political. And when there is a grassroots movement that can say, okay, let's work with that. Let's figure out what to do with that. Let's figure out how that situation happened, and let's figure out what we can do. That concern, I want clean water for my kids, starts to become an opportunity for education. It starts to become an opportunity for someone to say, really the root cause of this is actually perhaps corruption. Really, actually, the fact that this corruption is affecting my community, I'm now seeing it's actually affecting a lot of other communities. Maybe there's 10 communities that don't have clean water, or maybe it's just mine, but in other communities, there's corruption's doing other things. So there's an opening to education that movements create to people, for people in their involvement. Movements serve people. They provide, sometimes for material needs, sometimes services like hot breakfast, sometimes childcare, sometimes training, sometimes health education. Sometimes, or often, I take it back, I would say virtually always successful movements also serve psychological needs. Movements can be seen also as communities, and communities that continue over time are concerned with the well-being of their members. They are concerned with people's emotions, their psychology, what makes them feel part of something and keeps them going. And then, of course, they mobilize people, and this we know. This gets back to the image of the protest. We know movements mobilize people, but there are these other functions. And movements over time may emphasize one function over another. Some movements are really predominantly about service and education versus mass mobilization, or vice versa. But that I wanted to get at with the definition of movement that I wanted to offer you today. And if you accept this definition, there's a few characteristics that come out of it. And the first is that movements are based on voluntary participation, right? So there's a huge difference between a movement and an organization. Because an organization, can pay people. I mean, some organizations can't. Some organizations only exist on paper. Some organizations are mostly volunteer. A lot of organizations, though, they have a formal structure. In countries where you can register them freely, they register. In countries where they can raise enough money to have a budget, they have a budget. They have staff. And so there's a clear structure. And an organization can exist even if sometimes there's only one person holding it on out of a room in their house, right? And more broadly, when we look at corporations, governments, military, we see real big organizational structures where if you want to get someone to do something, you can try to pay them more, promise them a promotion, or say if you don't do what the plan is, we're going to have real problems for you. You could get fired, you could get demoted, whatever. And so there's all kinds of ways in a formal organizational structure that you can sort of try to get people to do certain things. But movements are based on voluntary participation. If people don't want to be part of a movement, they just don't show up, or they don't participate. And this makes it very, very different from an organization, and it means the entire challenge of thinking through how people organize themselves, maintain unity, sustain themselves, deal with repression, I would argue has to be thought of outside of the strict organizational frame. Now, organizations sometimes can play a key role in movements, of course. There can be coalitions of organizations that are critical in the effectiveness of movements over time. The US civil rights movement, as Mary King mentioned yesterday, was a movement of movements. Lots of local manifestations, and there were some key organizations in that movement. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was one. The Urban League was another. The Congress of Racial Equality was another. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was another. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, of which Martin Luther King was in a leadership role, was part. And each organization brought different things, different skills, different competencies to that movement. So the organizational aspect was very important. But the movement was not 5 organizations. It was much bigger than that. And fundamentally, you can't get that movement unless you get lots of people doing things because they feel like they want to be part of something voluntarily. Now, to get that voluntary participation, what makes people decide they're actually going to do something? Join. Commit their precious time and energy. Possibly take a risk or make a sacrifice. Movements that are successful, I've found, have to show that they represent people. What does it mean to represent them? It's not so much necessarily about having a 10-point political platform. That could be part of it. But it's also about being able to communicate in ways that people understand. If the majority of a society that a movement is aiming to mobilize considers themselves not political or not politically involved, coming to them with political slogans may do absolutely no good. Speaking in the language and terms that make sense to them, that are meaningful to them, if it's clean water, and so forth, is very important. Understanding people's values are very, very important if they have a strong religious or cultural affiliation or sense of patriotism and so forth. And when people come to meetings or participate, having them feel like I came here and I was welcomed, for example, could be very important for a movement. So this issue of is it representative is critical. And the issue is not so much for movements. Well, we know what's important to these people. We've told them. We represent them. No. The issue is, do the people who you want to organize feel that you represent them? That's really the critical thing. Often diverse. Often diverse. We will go through this week case studies of different movements. And sometimes what you see, I'll use the Polish case study of Solidarity in the 1970s and 80s as an example, is different segments of the population organizing by themselves for different goals. So in Poland in the 70s, the workers would organize and they would be put down. Some of the urban professionals and sort of intelligentsia, intellectuals would organize and they would be put down. Workers, there was not the solidarity, which later the movement came to be called, so clearly they developed it. And so movements that want to achieve major changes often have to go outside of their initial base, A student movement that wants to achieve things bigger than the university at some point usually has to grow to include other publics that they may not normally think about, that they may actually actively not like or not trust. But frequently what we see with movements is they have to start building this unity, this diverse unity. Not an organization, we discussed that, and not a spontaneous outburst. My favorite example is it's not a trending Twitter hashtag. It's not a clever viral clip on YouTube. They have to sustain themselves. So maybe I'll stop there and just, do people have any quick questions or comments? We'll definitely have more time later. Yeah, Adejo, and then Andre. Yeah.
Just a quick question about, in the definition of, and the characteristics of civil movement, civil resistance,